Hello, I'm Sudip Maitra, and today I will present a review of a very influential and seminal paper on a vulnerability called Meltdown, which has the potential to make researchers and industry leaders to rethink how CPUs are designed. So let's see what Meltdown is. Meltdown is a microarchitectural vulnerability that affects millions of devices by exploiting out-of-order execution and cache latency measurements to read kernel memory from unprivileged user process. So let's see what makes this vulnerability very special. The cornerstone of modern computer security relies on address space isolation that protects user process from accessing kernel memory and other user space. Meltdown undermines all security measures built on top of this address isolation principle. Since this is not a software issue and is related to how modern CPUs work, it forces us to rethink how CPUs are implemented. This vulnerability has been present since the mid-90s, and it's very surprising it took so long to find this vulnerability. And since it's inherently a hardware issue, it doesn't have any dependence on the operating system. So the effect of meltdown is very widespread. So let's see how meltdown affects our lives. All form of security relying on address space isolation is rendered useless because of meltdown and affects all operating systems. So it doesn't matter what operating system you use, you're still affected. It compromises security implemented on hypervisors, virtual machines, and containers. Um, Basically, Meltdown enables an attacker to read your kernel, thereby letting the attacker or enabling the attacker to steal your cryptographic keys, your private data, everything on your computer. Security foundation of any modern computer relies on address space isolation. A supervisor bit determines if a process can access a particular memory location, thereby isolating user processes from kernel. This is the principle by which you can run multiple processes on the same hardware without losing privacy. One keynote here is that the way modern processors work is that each process maps the entire kernel memory onto their virtual address space for performance reasons. Now I'll explain the meltdown attack, and to understand it we need some background knowledge which will act as the building blocks for this attack and will eventually work up to the actual attack. So let's start with out of order execution. So let's say we have a primitive CPU on our left, which fetches, decodes, and executes instructions sequentially. So as time moves on, it first fetches instruction from the main memory, decodes it, and then executes it, and then repeats the cycle. But that's not very efficient because when it's fetching, it's not doing anything else. And these units are basically idle. So that's not very efficient. So let's see if we can make things better. So let's say we have a CPU that has multiple pipelines. So it has an execution unit, decode unit, and a fetch unit, and it can run them in parallel. So once it has fetched an instruction, it can, in the next clock cycle, it can move on to decoding it, but also it can fetch another instruction from the main memory. And for the third, it can execute the first instruction, decode the second, and fetch the third instruction, and so on. And in this way, you can see the performance is a lot better than the primitive CPU we had on our left. Here we have a modern Intel Skylake architecture, and as you can see, there's multiple ALU units, load story units, that can run in parallel given the operations are independent from each other. So let's try to understand what out of order execution is. So let's say we have a certain operation that we need to do, and let's translate that into assembly. So at first we move A, B, C, and D into registers, and then add A, B, and then multiply C and D, and add those results together and move the result back to X. Now on our right we have a CPU that has 3 pipelines, and it does everything sequentially and in order as it appears in our code. So for the first 4 clock cycles, it moves in the data into the register. On the 5th clock cycle, it adds A and B together. 6th clock cycle, it multiplies C and D, and then adds the results from step 5 and 6, and then on step 8, it moves the results back to X. Now it is evident that our previous approach wasn't very efficient, because when the load store unit was working, the ALU and multiplication unit were doing nothing. So let's see if we can improve the performance. So on the first 2 cycles, clock cycles, we moved in A and B to the registers. Now at this point, nothing is stopping us from adding A and B together, because that doesn't depend on any other operation. So on the 3rd clock cycle, we load in C to register 2, and we can also add A and B together. So the 5th line actually moves up, and we execute 3 and 5 together. Next up, we load in D to R3. Now we can't multiply that until the next clock cycle, which is on the 5th clock cycle. We multiply C and D together, and on the 6th clock cycle we add the results, and then we move the results back. So here we have saved 1 clock cycle. So we've improved our operation by 1 clock cycle, but you can imagine how more complicated operations can add up, and the performance can be improved because of out of order execution. So as you can see, the operations were not happening in order, and we did something out of the order. So that's why this is called out of order execution. In addition to out of order execution, CPUs do speculative executions as well. So let's explain that with a toy example. So here we have some arithmetic operations, and then a conditional statement, and more arithmetic. So let's say we have a computer that has 2 pipelines, which means basically has 2 ALU units, and both of them can run simultaneously. So here we have a condition which the CPU has to evaluate, but what the computer does, or the CPU does, is it speculates about the value of X. It basically says, well, I don't have the value of X yet, but there's a good chance it's going to be less than 100. So I might as well run these commands, and if I don't need it, then I can just undo everything, or I can just throw away the results. So what it does is it executes these codes out of order, and then if it's not true, then it basically throws these results away. And if it evaluates to true, then it already has the results, so it puts it puts the results in the variables. Let's talk a little bit about how addressing works. So each process in a computer maps the entire physical memory along with the kernel into a virtual memory. The physical address is banked in 4 kilobyte pages and mapped to virtual memory using page tables. KSLR is a technique to prevent side channel attacks by randomizing the start address of the kernel. This will become important later on in our presentation. So getting data from the physical memory is quite a slow process. So modern computers have something called a cache, which stores required instructions and data. It basically copies some addresses from the main memory to cache, and because of that, everything CPU needs to do a certain operation is immediately available, and it's a lot faster to access in the cache than to access the physical memory. So in modern computers, RAM access can take around 100 nanoseconds, and cache access can take about 1 nanosecond. So flush plus reload is a cache timing attack where an attacker flushes the cache and then reloads the specific address to see if it was accessed by other processor or not, thereby checking whether address is being used by another process. So this is basically called a cache timing attack, and this is one of the building blocks to Meltdown, and we'll see how this fits into the whole attack scenario. Now that we have all the background for understanding Meltdown, let's evaluate this toy example. So just like the code before, we have a bunch of arithmetic operation and then some malicious code that accesses the kernel memory. Because of out of order and speculative execution, these operations will be executed out of order. Now normally if you read kernel memory from user space, the CPU will raise a hard fault, which is called a segmentation fault. However, the condition is actually, the permission is actually checked much later. The CPU doesn't yet know if this is going to be true or not. If this is true, and only then it's going to raise the fault, but it doesn't know that yet. So the kernel is read, and the byte is ANDed with a 1 bit. So depending on the content of kernel memory, the last bit can be like 1 or 0, and the Q prime can be 0 or 4 or 96. And then the next instruction reads from either 4096 or 0, depending on the last bit of the content inside kernel memory. Now, an attacker can read or measure the time to access location 0 and 4096. Whichever one is faster, the attacker knows that one was indeed cached. So ultimately it reveals that if reading 0 location is faster, then indeed the last bit of the kernel memory byte was 0. If it's 4096, then the last bit of the kernel memory was indeed 1. And iterating through this whole process again and again, the attacker can basically read the whole content of the kernel. Now, it is important to mention here is the attacker makes sure that X is never 0, so this condition is never true. This is a way of handling or suppressing the segmentation fault. The other thing is the attacker makes sure that all the location from 0 to 496, these are not cached. So they use a flush command to make sure these are all flushed from the cache, so that when this program, this thread executes and caches location 0496, the attacker knows for sure that this is the only thread that accessed these locations. Now that we are familiar with the attack, let's see some of the limitations and workarounds for Meltdown. So when authors mounted this attack, they saw a bias towards 0, but it's easy to reduce with retry loops. Reading one bit at a time is faster as it only requires one flush reload instruction, but bias towards 0 increases. KSLR is limited to only 40 bits of randomization, so testing 128 times in 8 GB steps for an 8 GB RAM would reveal the kernel location. So it's not much of a challenge. The attacks were successfully carried out on different Intel CPUs and Samsung Exynos chip, and across all major operating systems. However, AMD, the attack doesn't work on AMD and ARM processors. Let's see how fast you can read kernel data with the Meltdown. Well, in most cases, if your data is in L1 cache, then you can read kernel memory at half a megabyte per second speed, which is not bad. In case of the Xeon processor, as you can see, the error is pretty high, but if you slow down, then the error is 0. Well, in case your data is in L3 cache, the speed is much lower. And if it's uncached, then it's much lower. As you can see, it's 10 bytes per second. But with some optimization, you can improve the performance. So what optimizations am I talking about? So one optimization is, let's say your data is not in the cache. You make another thread prefetch the data into the cache, and then you can also do triggering with hardware speculative prefetcher to improve the speed. Now, Meltdown doesn't work on ARM and AMD chips, and the authors speculate that they handle TLB differently. What TLB is basically like a cache for page tables. Also, how permissions to access locations are handled might be different. It's not possible to know exactly what's going on because these are proprietary knowledge, and you have to sign NDA to know all that. According to the authors, the only CPU that should be susceptible is A75, but it's not available, so they didn't test that. So we've established how severe this attack is and the consequences of this attack or vulnerability. So how do we mitigate this vulnerability? Can we disable out of order execution? Well, that's not the best idea because we would lose so much performance if we do that. And what about checking permission before every register fetch? Well, that's going to slow down the process as well. So that's not a feasible solution either. What we really need is a hardware split between the kernel and user space. But that's a hardware solution and requires redesigning the CPU, which will take time. A quick software fix is Kaiser, which is a patch where you do not copy over the entire kernel on the user memory and only keep the essentials. Although this is not a complete solution, it reduces the attack surface significantly. So major players in the industry like Microsoft, Apple, Linux, and they have patched their kernel inspired by Kaiser. I think, well, this is my solution. I'm not sure if it's even feasible, but I think CL flush can be made a privileged operations as not many user programs need that anyway. And even if we cannot do that, frequent CL flush commands by a user process is suspicious and can be detected. So if we see a user program accessing or using CL flush very frequently, then we can label that process as a malicious process and terminate them. In conclusion, the paper presented a novel microarchitectural vulnerability that exists in most modern CPUs, and the effect of the vulnerability is very severe. Even though Kaiser is an effective solution against Meltdown, it still requires some mapping of some kernel memory in the user space. And also the performance hit is quite a lot. It is estimated to be anywhere between 5 to 50% depending on what you're doing. So hardware optimization is known to leak information, but usually it's accepted because either the effects are trivial or the attack is much more involved. Meltdown is much simpler and has a widespread effect. So it changes everything. Meltdown enables attackers to read every single bit at a very respectable speed, and no cryptographic solution or software patch can protect against such a attack. Ultimately, CPU hardware needs to be redesigned, which makes Meltdown one of the most challenging vulnerability to overcome in modern computing. That's all for my presentation on Meltdown. Thank you for listening, and if you have any questions regarding this paper, feel free to email me.